Hello and welcome to the Karate Priest Podcast. I'm your host, Father Daniel Duplantis. I'm a martial artist, musician, airman, and a priest of the Diocese of Houma-Thibodaux. One of my other passions in life is teaching, especially teaching about the Catholic faith. Catholicism is a very deep faith. Jesus himself told Peter to put out into the deep for a catch. The most significant answers to life's most important questions often lie deep beneath the surface. Many people have questions about their faith. Through this podcast, my aim is to explore these questions and encounter incredible people along the way. Their stories show that God is constantly at work in our lives every single day, sometimes in the ordinary and sometimes in the extraordinary. Some of the topics treated in this podcast may be sensitive or controversial, but their discussion holds the key to truly living as God created us to live, which is to say that He created us to live in authentic freedom, loving Him above all else. Thank you for joining me on this journey of faith, and I hope you enjoy this podcast. Hello and welcome back to the Karate Priest Podcast. I'm your host, Father Dan, and today I'm going to do a little bit of a new kind of episode, something that I think is great for this summer, and that is a book review. I know I talked a little bit about a particular book a while back, but that wasn't so much a review as much as taking a topic that was presented, namely the temperaments. We did a 3-part series on that and kind of breaking some of that open. But today I actually want to do a little bit more of a book review. Especially because I've been reading this particular book today that we're talking about for the last couple of weeks. And I'll be real honest, it has rocked my world, especially as a priest. And a little bit of backstory before I kind of get into the book. I've had this book sitting on my bookshelf probably for the last, I think, 6 years. It's something that we started a little group study with when I was transitioning from the college seminary to the graduate seminary. And I don't think we actually finished the book. I think we kind of started a few meetings, and as sometimes happens, these groups kind of fall apart because, we're from different dioceses around the country. And so it's kind of hard to do that. And this was before really a lot of people were, I guess, more adept at doing virtual meetings. This was 4 years before COVID. So, I think this would be more successful as a group meeting virtually nowadays. But anyway, I decided to break it open again this summer. And I guess, after having a lot more seminary behind me and, actually having some pastoral experience, I really enjoyed this book. And I hope it's something that, I think any Catholic can actually pick up and read. And it's called Forming Intentional Disciples, The Path to Knowing and Following Jesus. And it's written by Sherry Waddell of the Catherine of Siena Institute. And this book is all about intentional discipleship. That's what the title is, Forming Intentional Disciples. So what does she mean by that? And she gives a lot of statistics in this book. But the idea is that just because a person finds themselves in the pews on Sunday does not mean they're intentionally following Christ. And so she wants to hash that out. What does it look like when you have parishes that are not full of the intentional disciples, that you have people coming to Mass, but they're not perhaps really intentional about how they're following Christ, as opposed to parishes that are full of intentional disciples and people who are really just on fire with God and really made a conscious decision to have Him as the center of their lives, and not just in word, but in everything that they do, every aspect of their lives. That's what this book is about. And that's why, it's a great summer read. It's not a long book. It's not a complicated book to read. The book is, 12 chapters long, and it comes out to 256 pages. It's really not a bad read at all. In fact, actually, I got so hooked into it, sometimes I was reading 2 chapters a day. But I want to kind of start with, where she's coming from and why she's writing this book. On the back cover, she's got some statistics, and a lot of this is just, the status of the church in the United States. All right. This is not, she talks about some trends around the world, but primarily focusing on trends in the US. And so on the back cover, she has a few of these. She says only 30% of Americans who were raised Catholic are still practicing. Fully 10% of all adults in America are ex-Catholics. The number of marriages celebrated in the church decreased dramatically by nearly 60% between 1972 and 2010. And only 60% of Catholics believe in a personal God. And I preached a little bit on this in the last few weeks for my homilies, especially because we had Pentecost, Trinity Sunday, Corpus Christi. It's been a great time to go into like a State of the Union address, essentially in my homilies, like go into like the status of our church and what has to happen for us to fix things, and it's actually been very well received. I think, this is the kind of book that at this time of year, as we just went through these major feast days of our church and of our faith, gave people a wake-up call, a call to say, wow, like we have our work cut out for us. And it really should move us towards some kind of action. We can't really be lukewarm in this. And that's what she's trying to say is that, intentional disciples are not lukewarm. They're people who really God is the center of everything that they do. And not just that, but even their conversations, like, the way that they talk about God, because she even talks about like how we almost have the sense in the Catholic Church of like, don't ask, don't tell, in the sense that we don't talk about our faith publicly a lot. And that's a problem for a lot of people is that, if we're going to evangelize, we have to be intentional ourselves about being able to have conversations about Jesus. So that's basically the premise for the book, is looking at, what do we have to do to maybe start changing things in the church? And she gives a lot of trends happening, like the decrease of priests over the last several decades, the decrease in different generations coming to our masses, and so looking at all these statistics. And so I'd like to maybe talk about some of these, because I think if we see these numbers, it should inspire us to do things. And so she talks about, like, she calls it climate change. And it's funny how she uses these different, relevant terms that we hear so much in the media, but it applies to our church as well. The climate change in the church. And she's not talking about weather either. She's talking about just like the religious climate we have as Catholics. So for Christianity, conversions and defections worldwide in 2010, she said there were 16 million conversions, 43,800 converted every day. And then there's 11.6 million left the church. So we're talking about conversions to and from the church. So 16 million converted to the church in 2010, and 11.6 million people left the Catholic Church in 2010. So the net gain, was slightly under 5 million, about 4.5 million converts. But with that, still, like, we lost 11.5 million Catholics in 2010. Like, the net gain isn't what we should be focusing on either. Like, it should be alarming to us that we lost 11.5 million Catholics a decade ago. On top of that, births and deaths worldwide, this is always important to look at. There were 45.2 million people born into Christian families, and 21.7 million Christians died. So in 2010, Christianity's net gain was 27.8 million. So yeah, again, like, the whole idea isn't just to look at like the fact that we had a net gain of Christians and converts in the Catholic Church in 2010. But again, the fact that we lost 11.5 million, like, why are that many people leaving the Catholic Church? That's a big question she wants to answer in this book. And the fact that a lot of people, they aren't just leaving us for other religions. Many people are just giving up on religion entirely. Now we're seeing a mass exodus from organized religion in this day and age. And so she's trying to, look at that as well. And so when she looks at people who affiliate as nuns, we call them N-O-N-E, nun, not the nuns that wear habits, but people who have no religious affiliation. She says that 16.1% of adults are unaffiliated, that a third just haven't found the right religion. 24% of 18 to 29-year-olds are unaffiliated. So, like, that's my age group right now. Like, I'm 28 years old right now. And so this is my age group of young adults, that a quarter of young adults are unaffiliated, have no religious preference whatsoever. But the encouraging thing is that for those who are religiously unaffiliated, 94%, so almost all religiously unaffiliated people, believe in some kind of God or universal spirit. Half of them, 49%, believe in a personal God. 30% are formal members of religious congregations. 11% attend religious services weekly, and 46% attend at least yearly. And so she's looking at this, but at the same time, like, who is in our pews is really, really important. And the reality is that right now, my generation, millennials, are almost non-existent in our parishes. We have a lot of boomers right now, a lot of Generation X, but Generation X is where the drop off really starts to happen. And so when we get to my generation of millennials, and I'm a late millennial, we're seeing a problem where, we're almost non-existent in mass attendance. And so we have a huge problem where in the next couple of years, the church is literally dying out. And so we have to fix that. We have to evangelize in our parishes. A lot of people want to jump and say, well, it has to start with our youth ministry or our youth formation. It's like, well, no, not quite necessarily. It has to start at every single age group. Like, we can't neglect one particular demographic over another. Every soul is worth saving. And so we have to be able to look at every single demographic. And that's what she goes through in the book as well, is the fact that we can't just start with one particular age group. Just the fact that millennials are missing doesn't mean that we have to spend all of our time and energy trying to evangelize millennials. So that being said, one of my favorite things about this book is what she calls the 5 thresholds of conversion. And for me, this is really like the plan of action. Like, she lays out in the first half of the book, this is the situation. This is where we are as a Catholic Church in the United States. The second half of the book focuses on like the game plan. Like, how do we enter into conversations of conversion with people? How do we get people to come to know Christ, to accept the message, And she lays out a step-by-step process, and it's really organic. And the first phase, and I'm going to kind of talk about just briefly the 5 thresholds. I don't want to get into too much detail because I actually want you to read the book. But she talks about these 5 thresholds of conversion. And the first one is very, very fundamental, and it's trust. It sounds simple, like of all things, the first step in any kind of conversion, or really, and I like to use it this way as well, in any relationship, is trust. If you don't trust somebody, are you going to enter into a relationship with them? So perhaps we could ask the question, why are people not entering into a relationship with God? Why do people not believe in God sometimes? I think a lot of it is because they don't trust God, or they don't trust who they perceive God to be, I think is the more accurate way to say that. I think people have an image in their head of God, and that image oftentimes is wrong. It's a stereotype. It's planted in there by somebody else. And so they're having to overcome these hurdles because there's a lot of really just lies in who they think God is. But again, it starts with trust. So that's how you enter into a relationship with somebody. And then from there, things tend to unfold. From trust, the next thing is curiosity. And I like to use this also like in dating terms. So think of like, in a dating relationship that ends up in marriage. You trust the person enough to go on a date with them, right? On that date, you're curious about this person. That's the second threshold, is curiosity, right? You start asking questions. So like on a date, you start asking questions of the person. You want to know more about their life, right? There's this curiosity to understand the person more, right? And it's a very beginning phase, right? Just because you're curious and you're asking questions doesn't mean it's going to really affect your way of thinking or affect the relationship in, to a deep level yet. Same thing with conversion. People who start with trust, they meet a Christian or a Catholic that they trust, they start becoming curious as to, why does this person believe what they believe? Why do they live the way that they live? And so there's this kind of just this quizzicalness about things, that they want to understand more, but they're just, it's just curious. They're curious about what's happening, but it's not quite deep yet. I think, of like Pontius Pilate and Herod in the Gospels, they're curious about Jesus. They're asking questions, but that's where it stops for them because they fail to reach the next threshold of conversion. And the third one is openness, specifically openness to change, right? So going back to maybe the dating analogy, once you've gotten past the curious phase, right, you are open to then letting this person change your life, open to changing the way that you live, or even just for the sake of their good. You're inspired to change some of your bad habits for this person, right? Same thing with conversion, is that after curiosity, there should be this openness to change the way we see or do things, to change our lives, to change our faith, our beliefs. Again, it's not a guarantee of change. It is simply an openness to change. Maybe saying, I could see myself doing this. There's this relatability of, I can see myself with this person for the rest of my life, or I can see myself possibly going to mass or doing things that Catholics would do, right? If we're using these two different analogies. So again, this third threshold of conversion is openness. The fourth threshold of conversion is spiritual seeking. And this is where people really kind of get through the hard stuff. This is where conversion, or even any relationship, really gets deep, because now you're really searching for more. There's the striving to understand more, right? And there's a striving to find an answer to a question, right? And for the person who's seeking conversion, or chasing the idea, that question is, to God, are you the person to whom I will give my life, to whom I will give my very self, right? Same thing in marriage. When you get to like the deep part of a relationship, you're past the kind of puppy love phase, right? The big question is this the person to whom I will give my life, to whom I will give myself for the rest of my life, right? Now we're getting to something deep. We're getting to something substantial, right? And so this is where, in seeking, it's not crossing the final threshold, right? But it is getting to the verge of that, asking the really important question and pondering, searching for answers to it, really trying to find an answer to that question. Are you the one to whom I will give myself? And then the final threshold of conversion is intentional discipleship, right? So if we're using this for conversion, for someone who's dating, this would be marriage. This is relationship. This is covenant, commitment, things like that, things that define marriage. For a convert, this is actually taking everything that you've done, the openness to change, the seeking, finding the answer, saying yes, like this is who I will give my life to, like saying that to God, I will give my life to God, and what does that actually mean? It means giving everything to God, our thoughts, our words, our actions, every single part of our life. Intentionally, we choose to give to God, right? And not just in word, not just on our lips, but in the way that we live our life, because faith is manifested by the way that we live. It's not just something that we say. It's not just something to be professed by words. It is oftentimes professed and witnessed to by the way that we live. And so that's the thresholds of conversion. That's the cornerstone of this book. And so I really think this is a good read for the summer, for something, if you're looking for something just to kind of shake things up for you, check this book out. Again, it's called Forming Intentional Disciples, The Path to Knowing and Following Jesus by Sherry Waddell. So that concludes today's episode. If you have any discussions, any questions, any thoughts on the book you'd like to give, find us on our Facebook, our Instagram, our email, thekaratepriest@gmail.com. And let's engage in some conversation. Let me know how you like the book. This is something that you can do as a group study. You can also buy a study guide that sells with the book. This is a perfect book for a group study, for a book club, especially, while we're in the summer right now. So again, thank you for tuning in and have a great day. Thank you for joining us for today's episode of The Karate Priest. If you enjoyed this podcast, go ahead and like The Karate Priest on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you're ever in South Louisiana, come visit me at the Cathedral of St. Francis de Sales in Houma. If you have any questions or comments about the show, you can also email me at thekaratepriest@gmail.com. Your questions are welcomed and may be used in future episodes. May the blessing of Almighty God, the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit come down on you and remain with you forever. Amen.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Please be sure to rate and review this episode. This podcast is produced by Todd Fisher and distributed by Metacortex Publishing. This podcast is copyright. Any previously trademarked or copyright content is used by permission. Information and opinions stated in this podcast should not be construed as medical advice. Please be sure to visit the official website for the International Association of Metatomics at metatomics.org or find us on social media for other unique content.